or what? Yep. All right. And we are live, Houston. This is your head heathen and host, Dr. Jerry Jaffe, the world's most highly educated stand-up comedian, welcoming my 12 regular listeners to this live stream of the Comical Heathen podcast. I have two guests with me. I have my guest co-host and good friend right here in Cleveland, John Hensler. How are you, John?
Good. How are you guys doing?
I'm okay.
Good.
And the reason this live stream exists is because I was able to connect with old friend, old acquaintance from a former lifetime. Uh, Let me just see. I have a couple of credits here I'm going to read for you. Comedian, TV writer, has performed on at least four continents, as far as I can tell. Theater Review called him, "Get ready for this, people." This is a quote. An immensely skilled comic artist and at the same time a very thoughtful humanist philosopher. John, I have found nothing more embarrassing than reading someone's website back at them. So please join me in welcoming Jeremy Elwood. How are you, Jeremy?
Nice. I'm good. Thank you, Jerry. Nice to be here. Nice to meet you, John.
Nice to meet you.
Excellent. Jeremy, I started this podcast a few years ago because, as a writer, college professor, comedian, I started writing a book on satire, and so I thought I would interview the comedians I knew and sort of get the view from the trenches, so to speak. And the good news is that book actually finally came out in 2024. So that's my product placement for the day. It's Religious Satire in the Era of New Atheism, available everywhere you buy books online. So please make sure you tell all your friends. If you two tell all your friends, that's like a shampoo commercial. You tell
Like
two
four
people, and
people.
they tell two people.
Yeah, I'd love to
Um,
say I've read it, but I haven't got around to it yet. It's on my pile.
yes.
Yeah.
Hey, as long as you bought one, that's all I care about. What you do with it after you've paid for it is your business.
Yeah. Fair
You
enough.
know. um, and now keep the podcast going, just primarily as an excuse to have fun conversations. I will say, John and my 12 listeners at home, regular listeners at home, I met Jeremy. I used to live in New Zealand in the aughts. I taught at the University of Otago in Dunedin. And I'm just saying that so I can tell people how I met Jeremy. He actually came to Dunedin during my time there to star in a play. So I actually saw you acting. I don't know if you remember. It was the almost one man show.
Yes. Yeah. I was trying to remember. I knew you started lecturing after I'd graduated from
Correct.
that course, but we met. Yeah, I was doing a play called Auntie and Me, and my
Oh yeah.
director was, I think, your boss at the time, Lisa Warrington. So
Oh,
I,
my boss, my mentor, and one of my
yeah,
best friends.
yeah, so that's how we met. So yeah, absolutely. It's a while ago, but not that long
Yes,
really
it
in the
was.
in the scheme of things.
And then while you were sort of in tenure at the theater, you came to the college and did a show because I remember watching you perform in Allen Hall, which is the
Right.
main theater venue for the University of Otago's theater department, at least once, maybe twice,
Mm.
but once 100% for sure.
Yeah, I might have done a couple. It's yeah, Allen Hall's a real home base. I love it there, and yeah, if I'm in town for long enough, you're gonna see me pop up and do a show somewhere. So yeah.
I did sort of make some social media posts about you and I getting to chat, and a Dunedinite, a New Zealander, did actually want me to ask you. So since we're on the topic, I'll just say Anna, I apologize. Annie from New Zealand asks, what is theater studies like at the University of Otago? I swear this is entirely unsolicited. Lisa Warrington, no one at the university asked me to ask this question. Literally, one of my Facebook friends, a Kiwi, brought it up. So, what do you
Yeah,
remember
I
of
mean,
your days?
it was a great. It's a great incubation zone, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
It's a university degree. It is a college degree, but it's a very practical course. So for whether you specialize in acting or directing, or these days actually playwriting,
Mm-hmm.
it's very hands on. They have a working theater. So they, I mean, at one point, and this is probably still true, it was the busiest theater in the country in terms of putting on new work because they would
Mhm.
do that lunchtime theater. Every
Mhm.
Thursday and Friday, there would be a performance. So you were putting on, what was that, 36 new performances a year. And so it was great. Dunedin in general, which is, Dunedin's it's a city, you know, smallish city at the bottom of the South Island in New
Mhm.
Zealand. For someone like me starting comedy there, its real magic was you could afford to fail. You
Mhm.
know, it wasn't, and if you were putting on a sort of experimental show or trying new material or whatever, you weren't spending a lot of money to hire venues or produce or publicize.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean that's something that you don't get in bigger places. I mean, I live in Auckland now, which is New Zealand's biggest city, and you know, just the practicalities of putting a show on here
Mhm.
are very different. So yeah, no, I will always appreciate my time
Do you still have your scarf?
there. Scarfies, yeah,
Yes.
I do have a scarf, but I think that's more from my winter gear actually comes more from the fact that originally I actually grew up not that far from you. I'm Canadian originally, but
Mhm.
so I spent quite a lot of time in Ontario. So that's where my winter clothing is probably too heavy for even a Dunedin winter. Yeah.
Well, I remember the years I lived in Dunedin that when, summer turned to fall and the
Yep.
seasons cycled around and summer came back around, John, every, you know, uh, middle of spring, I would put my long johns away. And every middle of summer, I would get them back out because it
Yeah.
was still so like
Sure.
70 is the hottest day of the year in Dunedin.
Yeah,
Wow.
it doesn't get hot. Yeah, yeah.
So where is that in terms? Because I'm trying to picture New Zealand's geography. Does it get more hot than in the south than in the north? I would imagine then,
Uh, well,
or I'm
I mean,
sorry, vice versa.
yeah, the
Yeah,
north has
yeah.
a
So,
more,
so
yeah, we're a long, thin country. If you think of us like that, if you think of us,
in the southern hemisphere.
yeah,
Right,
that's
right.
right. Yeah,
That's what I meant to
if
say.
you
Like dyslexia sometimes bites me.
if you picture us almost like British Columbia in a way, you know, we're long and thin, and or California, but
Yeah.
so the north is more temperate. The south does get colder, but it also depends in the south. I mean, if you're in the Dunedin is right on the coasts, and you get hit with a lot of southerly. I mean, the wind. There's nothing stopping the wind from Antarctica. It just hits you straight from
Mhm.
there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas a little more inland, it gets a bit more extreme. So they might actually get hotter in the summer, but obviously a lot colder. Most of our snow is in the South Island. Put it that way.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Would it
where
be comparable to like the Nordic region in the north, or like Norway and Sweden, or is it a bit more temperate?
it's much more temperate. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, where I live in Auckland. I mean, we're in summer at the moment. High 20 degrees Celsius. So what's that? 80s for you guys
Yeah.
Fahrenheit is
70s.
about as it's about as hot as it gets. But we don't drop below sort of 10 degrees
Mhm.
Celsius for us.
Okay.
The South Island will go more from minus 10 to 30, you know. So but it's far more temperate than Scandinavia,
Right.
for example. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, Auckland is known for its sailboats.
Yeah, yeah, we're a harbor city. We, you know, the whole city's built around. We're on a bunch of volcanoes, which is really smart place to build a city. But we have a big harbor, and it's yeah, there's a lot of sailing goes on. Yeah, I mean, it looks a bit like Vancouver or Seattle. You know, it's a bit like the Pacific Northwest. Um, yeah, it's a very beautiful city. I mean, it's our biggest city. I mean, it's still only 1.7 million. So, you know, we're not our whole population's about 5 million these days. So, well,
Right.
we're geographically reasonably big, but population
Right.
wise, we're a bit of a small town.
Yeah, I've heard that New Zealand, I mean, it was around 4 million when I was living there, but that was a
Yeah,
lifetime ago. So you hear the
yeah,
number 5
it's
million. But you also hear, and I don't know that there's a real accounting, but that there might be 1 million Kiwis living overseas, right? That there's an
yeah.
extra million somewhere,
It
just
it
scattered
wouldn't
around the globe.
It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, it really wouldn't. We are a nation of travelers. There used to be this real rite of passage that we called the OE, the overseas experience,
Hmm.
which is like a gap year. You know, people would
Hmm.
finish their studies either at high school or at university, and they would go away for a year. You know, traditionally to London or to the United Kingdom, but these days, yeah, all over the place, and a lot of them stay there, obviously. So it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know any exact numbers, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was six or more million of us scattered around.
That's what.
Well, we're here primarily to talk about comedy. And I do want to say someone who is one of our regular listeners just dropped a question into the chat. So
Mm,
let's start tackling some comedy questions. Dan
sure.
wants to know, do comedians in New Zealand worry about cancer culture?
Cancer culture?
Cancer culture or
Cancer,
cancel? Yes,
cancel culture. I say
we worry
cancer
about
culture.
both.
Yes.
Um, Look, I think we're having the same discussion that comedians anywhere are having. Um, it gets raised. Personally, I don't really think it exists. You know, I think there's perhaps a level of scrutiny and a level of,
Mhm.
for want of a better word, censorship that goes on. But I mean, I don't think anyone's really getting cancelled, you know, unless you've been convicted of something, and that's actually being convicted rather than cancelled.
Yes.
Um, you know, you look at some of the biggest touring comedians of the world at the moment. I mean, Louis C.K. is still selling out arenas. You can't tell me the
Mhm.
guy's been cancelled.
Mhm.
So yeah, we're having the same discussion. Maybe it's not quite as obvious because I mean, simply on population size, you know, we don't have the huge groundswell of
Mhm.
young people, you know, taking offense at certain things. A lot of that actually comes from comedians themselves rather than audiences. You know, there's a lot of self-policing going on in green rooms, I think.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, I mean, are we having the conversation? We are having the conversation? Do we worry about it? I mean,
Mm.
I can't give you an example of someone who's I can't give you an example of someone who's kind of been bumped out of the industry or bumped out of doing what they do unless there's a little more serious underlying reason for it. You know,
Mhm.
if you're bordering on, there's a difference between being cancelled for something you say and being kind of sent to Coventry for something you've done.
Right. What
And,
um
and it's
I mean
almost a badge of of honor to have been canceled. I mean, if you think of Shane Gillis, I didn't know who he was until he
Yeah,
got to Saturday Night Live and then got canceled off of it. And now I hear
yeah.
his name all the time, and you know he's got Netflix specials and stuff. So I mean, it's if anything, I mean, no publicity is bad publicity, so to speak. So I mean, it's almost something you almost like want to be canceled because then you make or that Kill Tony guy. That's the same thing that you know.
I was about to bring that up actually. The Kill Tony example. I mean, Kill Tony within comedy circles was reasonably well known. And I'm sorry, I'm calling him Kill Tony because I've forgotten his last name. But you know, no one would have accused him of being a mainstream sort of name that people know. And
Mhm.
then you know, within certainly within conservative circles, people know who he is now. Yeah. So
Well, I think some of the more high profile examples um is in the category of like maybe there's cancel and maybe there's a convicted, but there's also
mm,
getting fired. Like so like Roseanne was fired from her show,
sure.
which seems outrageous. And so I don't want to see anybody get fired from their job. But
Yeah.
that show was being produced by Disney, and Disney has like contractual rules about the behavior of their high
Oh yeah.
profile employees. So it wasn't like she didn't know. Now, she also might have mental health issues, so I don't know her
Mm.
personally. But just in terms of that example, what she was fired. She wasn't canceled or convicted.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, we maybe haven't had that. I mean, and mainly because I mean, we don't have a lot of people employed by, you know, those huge corporations, and that high profile in a way.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, there is that argument that I don't want to see anyone getting fired either. But I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen a contract from any of the major networks or someone from
Mhm.
Disney, but read the small print. You know, it's in there. It is, do not take on, you don't take on Disney's legal team on a comedian's salary. I'll tell you that right now. Even if your comedian's salary is Roseanne.
Yeah.
Well, you've written and made appearances on news shows as like the satiric comedian who's going to comment on the day's or the week's news.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to ask like two questions, but in terms of the cancel culture, are there topics you've encountered in the news that you thought like you couldn't touch or a comedian shouldn't make fun of? Oh,
I think he might have froze. I think his screen
yep,
froze.
Jeremy, we might have froze you there. My question was so awful, it flabbergasted him right into the, yes. Let me just see. Yeah, I have like a guest list, people at home. Don't worry, in the podcast version of this live stream, we'll cut the technical glitches out and just put in some theme music, like elevator music during this portion. Yeah, he is still listed as a guest, so it's something with the streaming. Hey, Jeremy, we've sort of lost you for a minute.
Oh, how are we doing? Are we there yet?
I can hear you again, but I can't, your video hasn't refreshed.
Did we lose you there for a minute? Yeah.
Yes, we did lose you for a minute. We can sort of hear you a little bit. Now you're
Am I
starting
back?
to.
Okay.
Yes, there's your beautiful face.
Okay.
Are you okay on your end?
Come.
Do we have to
Yes.
send John's
No, I'm not
wife
quite
over
sure
to
what's
sort
going on
out
there.
your
Anyway,
IT issues?
I'm okay on my end. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah,
So the
sorry,
last
sorry if we
question I
got
asked
off. I do remember
before
the
you-
question. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Let me ask it
So,
again for the sake
I
of
mean, I
making
work
it
on a-
easier to
Sure.
edit.
Yeah.
When
for
you're
the edit,
making
yeah.
you sometimes make appearances on like local news, being like the comedian who's going to make a satiric or humorous comments about the day's or the week's news. When you're in that kind of a role, are there any topics or issues that you're not comfortable tackling or you don't know that comedians should be making fun of?
Yeah, I mean, it's the big one is tragedy. You know, obviously, if you, so to give you an example, I've been working since its inception on a show. We have a show here called 7 Days. It's a weekly panel show where we discuss the news, and it's been going for we're heading into our 15th season.
Nice.
And because of that, you want to take a look at the big stories every week. But for example, you know, we had to go to air the week after Christchurch, a city here, had a massive earthquake that, you know, with a loss of life. We also had to do shows after various natural disasters and man-made issues, you know, in our country and internationally. And sometimes you just have to say it's too soon. I mean, it really is. In terms of sensitivity, that often isn't up to us. That's often up to the network who broadcast the show. You know, we will usually try and cover a show. I'll say I actually will try and cover the big story of the week, whether it be political or geopolitical or socially. And there certainly are times where the TV broadcaster will say, no, we're not doing that. But for me, yeah, I mean, for me, the big one is tragedy. When it comes to anything else, I mean, you're always going to annoy somebody. You know, you people. There are two sides to a story, and you're going to annoy somebody on one side, and I'm okay with that. I'm fine with that. I don't have an issue with that at all. But other people might.
I have a question, kind of in regards to you were talking about. It's customary in New Zealand for you to kind of travel the world and stuff like that. And that's always something I'm kind of jealous of as, you know, a citizen of the United States, because I'm impressed because I've been to Canada a couple of times, you know, and Puerto Rico is the most foreign country I've ever been to. And that's part of the United States, you know?
Yeah.
So I find it interesting, but also related to comedy. I think all comedians kind of like Eddie Izzard one time talked about he's done comedy in multiple languages and how
Yeah.
difficult that is because we all know there's a bunch of different ways around a joke. You can tell a joke a bunch of different ways, but one way is inevitably the funnier way to tell it. So to be able to do that in a different language and then to also bridge, I mean, we all know a joke that might work in New York City might not work in El Paso, Texas. So there's
Yeah.
kind of two barriers there. I mean, even though you're from New Zealand and speak English, you don't speak the same English we do here in the United States, the same English they do in the UK or in England. So is that a barrier in terms of language? And then, are things funnier in New Zealand because of the culture than they are in the United States? And is there a way to kind of bridge that gap to be like, this is funny here, and if I say it this way, it'll be funny in the United States too?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Someone like Eddie Izzard, I mean, that's a whole different level. Doing a
Yeah.
full show in another language, I mean, to me, that's incredible because for me, I mean, I think so much of comedy is not even about the actual, just it's not even just about the words, right? It's about your delivery, it's about your nuance, your inflection, and to do that in a language that actually, in some cases, Eddie doesn't even speak. You
Yeah.
know, it's not like he's fluent in that language. He learned the show. Um, the cultural difference thing, there are some. I mean, there are some specific references. I mean, if I mentioned, if I made a joke about Winston Peters to you guys, would mean nothing, right? He's our deputy prime minister slash foreign minister, and that would work here. What I have found traveling around, because I've been lucky enough to do this in a lot of different countries, I've actually found that you can actually explain things. Most 90% of the time, you can take the time and explain the context if you need to. And in some ways, I mean, that gives you an extra 5 or 6 minutes of material just on the one joke anyway, just getting the explanation across. I don't think there's a lot of things that are entirely lost in translation apart from those very specific
Mhm.
references that an everyday reference to you guys in Ohio, you know, might not mean anything to me, and vice versa.
Yeah, we're all at the end of the day, we're all humans living the
Yeah,
same life and doing the same thing, basically. So whatever you
yeah,
find funny is there's some way to explain it to somebody in a different culture, I would think.
yeah. And also, I mean, sometimes, like I say, I mean, there's a lot of non-verbal communication going on in stand-up. I mean, sometimes I've laughed at jokes that I don't get because it's obvious that it's funny to the person telling it, or it's in the way they tell them. Um, there is that, and in some ways, those cultural differences can be great as well. I often don't. If I see a visiting comedian come to New Zealand, I don't really. I'm not that interested in them making jokes about being in New Zealand. I'm far more interested to hear about their culture. Maybe that's just me. I'm not sure.
Mhm. Although, touring comedians often start with a few minutes of material about the
Yeah.
place they're visiting. I saw Eddie Izzard in Dunedin.
Right. Yeah.
One of the great side effects of being in New Zealand, even though compared to the United States, geographically seems so remote, is that every British comedian wants to do a tour of Australia. And as soon as they're in Australia, they're like, well, add a few dates in New Zealand as long as I'm there. So you
Yeah.
can see some really good comedians in New Zealand. I mean, internationally.
Yeah. We
Yes.
do sometimes. We sometimes get them. Not so much these days, but back when I was starting out, you would quite often get those big British names, particularly, would come to New Zealand to sort of try their new stuff. Before they took it to the Edinburgh. So you would actually go through a phase sometimes of seeing these amazing comedians not be very good because they were doing very. It was like watching a Chris Rock at an open mic night. It was sort of a slight disconnect. That's not happening as much these days, but yeah, I mean, and also we are sort of an exotic destination. The idea of going to New Zealand to do a show is
Mhm.
very exotic for people from a lot of the world, and we have to take advantage of that.
Especially probably since the Lord of the Rings, I would think. I mean, I think a lot of people
Yeah,
were made aware of that from those movies.
yeah, that really put us on the map, particularly in our line of work. In the entertainment industry. Prior to that, You know, there were a few New Zealand bands, maybe, and a couple of. I mean, Peter Jackson was making movies before Lord of the Rings. He had a bit of a sort of cult following.
Mhm.
But that was huge for our entertainment industry. Yeah, you really did get people, as opposed to, sport was always our big export before that, and so you would get people touring and playing with sports teams. But for comedians and actors and entertainers, yeah, Lord of the Rings was a big deal.
One of my Facebook friends called Amir, this is an old friend of mine from high school, asked a question, and I believe that this
Hmm.
question is actually about Peter Jackson, but the way that he phrased this question was, if you know Honora Ripper.
I don't know, before
No,
my
well,
time,
speaking of
yeah. She
tragedy,
died.
she died in
Yes,
the
yeah,
50s. So,
yeah,
yes. So, but
yeah.
other than being a little bit sarcastic, that was Peter Jackson as his films, did a couple like low budget horror films. And then like his
Mm,
first kind of big movie was Heavenly Creatures,
yeah,
and
yeah,
which was the film telling of that famous New Zealand murder case.
yeah.
Um, so do you have any, so to try to help Amir out and turn his question into a question that we can actually talk about, what are your, well, I'm struggling with saying something vague like um, feelings about Peter Jackson, but I want something like, I'll give you like an example. I apologize for hijacking. Let's give you a quick example.
Mm,
I
go
would
ahead.
meet people, and I know you have because that's where you're based, the years I was in New Zealand, who were in the Lord of the Rings movies.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
met a guy who was an orc for a year. He's not sure if he's on any single film shot of the
chant.
movie,
Yeah,
but for every day for a year, he showed up, got dressed up like an orc, and there was like a holding pen. We need 5 orcs. Come over here.
yeah.
So, I mean, so you must have like some intersections with the work of Peter Jackson, actors, artists, Sir Jackson himself.
Oh yeah,
So,
of
what do you
course. I
think?
mean, we are a small, in terms of population, we're a small country, so you do meet those people. I mean, my favorite personal one of those is when I was growing up, my best friend at school. I mean, in his spare time, he was very much into role playing games. He played MERP, Middle Earth role playing, and he was
Sure.
a huge Tolkien fan. So he used to make everything from small models to life size figurines of orcs and
Oh boy.
and stuff like that. So when the rumor started going around that Peter Jackson was making these films, I suggested that he get in touch. It was almost a joke, really, but he did, and he's been a prop and character designer at Weta Workshops, the special effects guys, ever since. And he did make a lot of those props for the movies. So I love that's a little connection here.
Yes.
So
Well, I think one thing I found in New Zealand, being a smaller population country and even geographically smaller than the U.S., is it's like 2 degrees of separation. It's
oh yeah,
like you know a lot of people, and they know everybody else. Like
yeah,
there's not a third layer. And I remember when I first got to Dunedin, our good friend Hillary Hallbaugh, who's a fantastic
yeah.
actor and acting teacher, said to me after I was there for 3 or 4 months, she was trying to illustrate this sort of closeness of the population. And she said, right now, Jerry, people in Auckland are talking about you.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? She goes, you're the new theater person in the whole country.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
so like, yeah,
No, it's
no,
it's it's
no one even in Cleveland was talking about me when I got my job in
yeah,
Cleveland, let
yeah.
alone
No,
the other side of the country.
oh, I mean, I use it at the example that, I mean, I'm a comedian. Sure, I've done a bit of television stuff and a bit of new stuff, but I've personally met 6 of our prime ministers over the years.
Mhm.
There's a couple of them I have their numbers in my phone. And there is no reason for me to have that. There is no reason whatsoever. We are small like that, and it's very hard to be a sort of, there are no kind of untouchables here. Like you
Mhm.
name a big name New Zealand actor, and the odds are you've passed them in the street, or
Right.
you've been in a cafe with them, and yeah, like you say, it's a small industry. If you take a theatre job in Otago, in Dunedin, uh, theatre practitioners in Auckland are going to know about it, because it's a small community, and comedy is definitely like that. I mean, yeah, there isn't a New Zealand comedian I haven't met. I mean, there just isn't.
So
Is it
how's that?
possible? Oh, go ahead, John.
I was gonna say, how's that scene look? Because I mean, with as small as it is, I mean, I'm aware of like the Flight
Mm,
of the Concords and like Reese
yeah.
Darby off of that even, but like, are there a fair amount of good sized names coming out? Because I mean, I even know just that, so I would imagine there has to be probably more just kind of hidden gems there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few who have made their mark. I mean, Flight of the Concords and Reese and I started at the same time. Reese and I have known each other for 30 years, um, and I mean, in the US, they're the most obvious names. In the UK, there's a young woman called Rose Matafeo who's been doing very well over there. Ursula Carlson, who's a South African-born but New Zealand-based comedian, who is actually about to come out in a Netflix movie with Amy Schumer, I think this week or next week. Um, and then underneath that, there's quite a lot of New Zealand comedians doing very well in Australia, which is obviously a much bigger market. But then even just at home, I mean, we have homegrown people who are literally household names in New Zealand that no one outside of the border may have ever heard of, but are very good at what they do. Um, our scene is sort of interesting in that it's changed a little bit now, but certainly back when I was starting, you we had a real diversity of comedy coming out because you couldn't afford to be too similar to somebody else simply because you just wouldn't get booked as often. The two of you, if I had a similar style to another comedian, we'd be splitting the gigs in half because people wouldn't book us, both of us, for the same night. So people did develop their own styles. Reese Darby, for example, I toured with Reese for 4 years, and one of the reasons that we could tour, and there were two other guys, a fellow called Chris Brain and Terry Frisbee, was that we all had different styles. So it became a good show to take on the road. Um, yeah, so it's a small scene, but it's a very productive scene, I think. That's changing with the internet. People are finding other ways to get out there. So I mean, as it is everywhere, I think.
What about say younger comedians, whether they're high school,
Mm,
college students, or just the typical middle-aged guy who always wanted to try comedy? There's most of the bigger cities in the US have like an active open mic scene.
yeah,
In Cleveland, I could go on stage every night if I wanted to. I just have to
yeah.
ferret out where there are shows. But in New Zealand, where are you practicing, or where are beginners practicing?
Well, funny actually. We're in a little bit of an economic downturn at the moment, so this isn't necessarily entirely accurate, like for today, but over the last couple of years, there have been a huge number of open mic nights.
Mm.
I would argue almost too many, where basically any I'm trying to say this, I'm not thinking of anyone specifically, but there are comedians who are looking for stage time, so they'll start an open mic night somewhere.
Sure.
And they'll bill it. They'll always bill it as the funniest comedians in town, and it's not. It's an open mic night, and that's how it should be billed. But you end up with, I mean, I think at one point in Auckland we had 10 weekly open mic nights happening, and quite often you'll end up the only people sitting in the audience are the other comedians who are on. It's not necessarily a healthy thing, but they are certainly out there. Yeah, I mean, we have the same thing. What we are missing a little bit is the other end of the scale. There's only two full-time comedy clubs in the country here.
Okay.
One in Auckland and a reasonably recent addition in Christchurch.
Okay.
There was one in Hamilton briefly. I think it's just gone out of business. Um, so while most of our towns and cities will have regular nights, like there'll be a weekly gig on somewhere, you're
Okay.
missing that ability to. I can't go to Wellington and just book 5 nights at the same club. I can't book a 4 gig run in Dunedin. I can
Mm-hmm.
book a one-off.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we're sort of missing that a little bit. That's the area of the market that's missing for us.
Being Canadian and a Kiwi,
Mm,
brings up a question I wanted to ask. And again, this is more about the culture of of the
sure.
countries. I noticed something sort of similar between Canada and New Zealand. And again, I want you to correct me or fix it if I've got the wrong end of the stick. I always thought, even as a young American, that Americans and Canadians are so similar, which in most ways we are. But if there's one thing that's pretty different, is that Canadians, I'm making also a wild generalization, they kind of have to worry about everything the United States does. Not even when Trump is president. I just mean in general. Every
Mhm,
action taken by the president or by Wall Street or by Hollywood affects Canada. But
mhm.
most Americans walk around not thinking about Canada at all. So there's
Yeah.
just like this huge asymmetry where one country is worried, if not obsessed. And with that in mind, when I got to New Zealand, I felt a similar dynamic with Australia.
Mhm.
That like New Zealanders have to at least know what's going on in Australia, and most Australians don't think about New Zealand twice a year.
Mhm.
So I
Yeah,
don't know. Does that
I
affect the culture, the comedy,
I think
anything?
it's fair. I mean, the biggest difference for us as opposed to Canada is we don't have a land border. You know,
Sure.
we are islands, so
Hmm.
we don't have to worry on a physical level. You know, if there's an economic change in the US, then things can get, it makes a big change on the Canadian border, for example.
Hmm.
Suddenly, economies go up and down. We don't quite have that. Culturally, we have tended to, and politically, it's sort of, I mean, there's no design to this, but politically, whenever New Zealand's gone left, Australia's gone slightly right, and vice versa. It sort of just seems to happen. It's kind of funny. Like we'll elect a Labor government, they'll elect a Conservative government. It's I don't know how that happens. Um, it does make a difference. I mean, I don't know if it makes a difference in terms of comedy. I don't know. I mean, the one thing it makes a difference for is economically. It definitely makes it, and not just
Okay.
Australia. We have to worry about what's happening in Asia.
Hmm.
What's happening in China makes a big difference to our economy, and also what's happening in the US and in the UK. I mean, we are an export nation, so at the moment, we're in a bit of a recession, and despite what political pundits would tell you, it's really got nothing to do with any decisions that have been made here. We're in
Right.
a recession because parts of the other world are in a recession, and we're getting the trickle down effect.
Right.
And that affects comedy in terms of people buying tickets and booking in advance and all of that. It affects the economics of our business,
Mm.
which
Sure.
isn't the fun bit.
Unless John has some hidden heritage I'm not aware of, us three
Mhm.
white guys are none of us
Yeah,
Maori. But I would just, if there's anything you feel comfortable saying about
sure.
intersections between Maori culture and comedy, that Americans would not know anything about, but that might give a
Yeah.
unique quality to some of Kiwi humor.
Yeah, I mean, we're going through an interesting time at the moment where relationship with Maori is front and center. It's there's a real bubbling divide between people who see New Zealand as a white homeland, an extension of the British Empire, and the truth, which is we have an indigenous culture. So it is kind of front and center. Interestingly enough, I mean, our best known local born and bred comedian was Billy T. James, who was a Maori performer. And he came from sort of, I guess you'd call it vaudeville, the show band era. And he's still sort of held up as the icon of New Zealand comedy. Um, but we still, I mean, certainly in terms of, I mean, I still think that culture is perhaps underrepresented in the certainly in the comedy that you see. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm not even going to make an attempt on finding reasons for that. But well, I mean, I don't think it's as simple as racism, for example. I just don't think it's as simple as people don't book Maori comedians. I just don't think that's true. Um, but in terms of the cultural divide, I mean, New Zealand culture is thankfully is heavily, I mean, influenced by not only Maori culture but also our Pacifica nations. You know, we
Mhm.
are a South Pacific nation, and we have a very large Samoan, Tongan,
Mhm.
Fijian populations here, and that
Mm.
does play in less overt ways. You know, there's a certain sort of cultural rhythm to us,
Mhm.
vocal rhythm that comes from those cultures, and you see it in stand up. Yeah.
Well, Kiwis are famous. I lived in Japan in an even previous
Yeah,
lifetime.
sure.
And when you would meet people from Australia, boy, did they like to drink. But when you meet people from New Zealand, there could be some drinkers too. But there was the book on Kiwi travelers was that they were always chill, that they're like the most laid back people you would meet while traveling internationally.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things we do, if anything, sort of underplay our own culture a bit,
Mm,
which has been can be a bit of a detriment, but it is also true. I mean, I remember I did some shows for our military in
mm,
2001 when there was a rebuilding effort in East Timor after the Indonesian debacle over there, and it
mhm,
was quite different seeing the way the Australian military went in and kind of ordered people around, told them how to do something, how to build a road, for example.
mhm.
Whereas the New Zealand guys would go in and sort of ask, you know, and go, how do you do it here? And that is the difference. I think we're a little less secure in ourselves, and that makes us inherently a bit more curious. I mean, again,
Sure.
these are generalizations. I've met just as many annoying New Zealanders when I'm traveling
Mhm.
as I have Australians or Americans. Um, but it goes
Well,
back
one of
to
the
that thing you were saying about Canada. We've got that little bit of a little brother syndrome. You know,
mhm.
yeah, we've been mistaken for each other long enough that you know, we know that people hear a New Zealand accent, and for most people, they'll immediately assume it's Australia. We're used to that. So yeah,
Well, it didn't help the one dude I knew in Japan who was one parent was Aussie and one was Kiwi,
right,
and he would introduce himself based on the crowd. Like he'd read the room and say whether or
right,
not he was Australian or New
yeah,
Zealander.
Well, that was one of the
Hey,
things
here's another.
on the flight of the
Go ahead,
Concorde.
John.
They had a similar thing of just how the interaction between Australians and New Zealand, and how the Australians kind of look down on each other. And that's kind of the first interaction I had. I didn't realize there was really even that much of a difference. I just assumed that both cultures were very much shared and kind of just saw themselves as each other. But that's, I think, my American glasses. I think.
yeah. Well, I mean, I'll tell you, this is I think I can tell this on behalf, but when Reese Darby, when him and his family first moved to Los Angeles, I mean, he would not infrequently run into people who genuinely thought New Zealand was a country that they'd made up for Flight of the Conchords. You know, that it was a fictional setting, that it was like, I don't know, Metropolis or something, or Gotham. You know,
That's
and
funny.
I think, you
That
know,
can't be
that
true.
no, it was absolutely true. I think it's far
I
more
believe it.
infrequent now, but yeah, no, I mean, he's told me that story that every now and again they'd run into someone who thought they just invented it.
Well, another place that was just invented. I happened last year to also be able to spend a week in Iceland,
Right.
and I did do a couple of shows while I was there. And for anyone listening to this podcast, there is an episode from last year where I interviewed some Icelandic comedians.
Yeah.
And there was interesting for me. I enjoyed it immensely, but there's something they said which I wanted your take on.
Mm,
And they were saying that like the art form of stand-up comedy is relatively new to Iceland. Even post COVID, it really started. Like there
okay.
was some earlier, but it was more like British style sketch comedy, like what you might see on TV.
Right.
And then what they told me, so I'm quoting someone, I'm not an expert. What they told me was with the rise of Netflix, Icelanders in general became familiar with the form of stand-up comedy.
Right.
And,
I can
yeah,
believe that.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
know New Zealand and Iceland, of course, different in 8,000 different ways.
Yeah.
But I wonder, did like the rise of Netflix or even just is stand-up comedy considered an American art form the way that jazz or Broadway musicals are?
Yeah, no, no is the simple answer. I mean, if anything, no, I mean, no, interestingly, Netflix, I'll get to that actually. I mean, the rise of internet comedy has made a significant impact, but our comedy tradition is very British.
Hmm.
You know, I only moved to New Zealand in 1989, but prior to that, and actually stand up as we consider stand up is
Hmm.
really kind of was properly born in New Zealand. I would in the early 90s. Before that,
Okay.
it did come more from that almost vaudeville, um,
Hmm.
and a lot of that came from the British influence. I mean, people grew up watching British talk shows, British game shows.
Hmm.
So the American style, if you like, or the American influence of comedy, I do think came a bit later here. Um, I was raised on American comedians. You know, when I was growing up, I was listening to people like George Carlin and Richard Pryor, and you know, they were my influences. But most of the people I started with were listening to, you know, Billy Connolly, but even earlier than that, watching the two Ronnies or Monty Python,
Hmm.
that British influences. So there are still, I mean, I still hear it all the time where I say people say, "Oh, British comedy, it's so much better than American comedy." You know, not something I agree with, but it is,
Hmm.
again, generalizing. That would be the sort of default setting in New Zealand. So what the internet has done to get to that point is expose people to comedy from a much wider range of places. People, American comedy is starting to get a much bigger foothold here. Um,
Okay.
you were saying about seeing people like Eddie Izzard come to New
Hmm.
Zealand. It's only really in the last couple of years that we've had the really big name American acts come through. You
Okay.
know, in the last couple of years, we've had Chris Rock, we've had Dave Chappelle, we've had Louis C.K. have come through and play big arena shows here, and that just didn't happen even
Hmm.
7 or 8 years ago.
That's
No, I
interesting.
didn't see. I didn't see anyone like big names from the U.S. in all the years
No,
I was in
no,
there. Go ahead,
you
John.
wouldn't have.
Well, I say it's interesting that, like you said, New Zealand, it's just really even just post COVID, and or not New Zealand, Iceland, and you said in New Zealand, it's in the '90s, and it's kind of like weird. But even American stand-up comedy really wasn't born until really the late '40s, early '50s, and didn't
Yeah.
really take off until
Hmm.
'60s, '70s, and that's something that's always interesting to me. I mean, you had vaudeville, you had the monologuist, but that
Hmm.
wasn't. You know what I mean? That was just doing like the one-off jokes and stuff. So like someone like Bob Hope, or you know what I mean? He was one of the forerunners, I think, of actual stand-up comedy. So it really isn't even that old here in the United States. So it's kind of interesting, really, to
Hmm.
think about that. Is that the evolution is relatively new everywhere, really, of comedy, stand-up at least.
Yeah, and very much ongoing. I mean, one of the things I'm really starting to notice for like a really immediate impact is the explosion of crowd work videos that are out there on
Right.
things like TikTok is affecting clubs because you are now getting audiences who are starting to come who that's what they consider stand-up comedy, so they almost feel like
Hmm.
they're expected to heckle. You know, they're expected to it's expected to be a two-way thing, and that's, I mean, that's something that's only really happened in the last, well, since COVID, really, the last couple of years.
Speaking of British comedy, I do think
Hmm.
another way that it like overlaps greatly with New Zealand culture is with the solo show. So that
Yes.
kind of like one person show, whether they're a monologuist like Bob Hope or doing an actual character, for example, like Steve Coogan
Mm.
might do a character rather than appear as Steve Coogan, but whether they're doing a character or themselves, but a kind of like solo show comedy, like what there is American style stand up in Edinburgh, but the majority of Edinburgh comedy is people doing solo shows. And New Zealand, as almost a pioneer country, has a
Mm.
great history in theater in general of one person shows. I think because they were cheap to tour. So you could just go to the provinces, go to the small towns and the schools and do your one person show. So
Well,
is
it's
there, yeah, so is there that British or European style solo show comedy?
yeah, there is, and actually it goes a bit further than that. I mean, most stand-up comedians, one of the things that you work towards every year is doing a comedy festival with a 1 hour solo stand-up show, and it might not be a character. It's just an extended set, really.
Right.
But it's an hour long. And I was kind of amazed actually when I went back to North America in the last few years to realize that that's not a thing in North America. Um, and like you
As
say, a
I've
big part of
learned.
yeah, but a big part of that is the ease of touring it, and a big part of it is what I said before is that we don't have the club set up.
Mhm.
You can survive in the US or actually in the UK with you could survive on a 25-30 minute set, the same set for a year because you can play it at clubs around the
Mhm.
place. You can't really do that here. You've got to change things up enough. So yeah, the solo show is definitely a thing, and our comedy festivals
Mhm.
are very much based on Edinburgh.
Mhm.
They are based on the solo
Sure.
show format, um, as opposed to showcases or
Mhm.
galas.
Right. Well, I think it's like evolved. I'm sure it's evolved since the aughts. I was in New Zealand from '03 to '08,
Mm,
by the way. But there is the New Zealand Comedy Festival, um, which does something similar. I
yeah,
feel like it might have, like, sorry for pausing. What I wanted to say is when I was there, they would have events all over the country. It
right.
seems like now they've like focused on a couple of locations, but try to make those locations into bigger events.
Yeah, you're right. It's basically Auckland and Wellington
Okay.
these days. They probably around the time you were here, they were still doing some stuff more regularly in Christchurch, and there would be a
Mhm.
touring roadshow. That's just economics.
Okay.
They weren't making money on that, and that festival. I mean, yeah, personally, I mean, I've done a dozen of those festivals, but I haven't done one for a number of years. I think that's changed a little bit. It's there's a lot
Mhm.
more Australian influence on it.
Right.
But it's also, I mean, I'm at a position where I'm not trying to break through anymore. I kind of, yeah. Well, I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and basically, if I want to get on a lineup somewhere, I can.
Mhm. Okay.
Those festivals, there are a lot of people. That's where they make their start. And whether
Right.
you should be making your start with a 60-minute solo show, whether that's a good idea, I mean, that's a whole other discussion.
So we're gonna wrap up in a few minutes. So John, if there's
Sure.
anything else you wanted to ask Jeremy, get your head on straight. But I just wonder, Jeremy, is there as the little brother syndrome, what would you like? Um, I apologize. What would you like people to know about either New Zealand culture or New Zealand comedy that you think might not be, well known in America or internationally? Like what's
Yeah. Um, it's kind of a funny one, and I guess this actually says I think people sort of assume that we're all amateurs. That
hmm,
it's that basically our whole comedy scene is a bit of an open mic scene. It's people who are doing
hmm,
it part time, and that's true here as well. I still have people. I've been a professional comedian, excuse me, for 25 years, and I still on a very regular basis have people ask what else I do, how I make a living. And so in some ways I kind of like I'd like that message to get out a little wider. You know, so if I'm contacting anyone about doing gigs over in your part of the world, I'd like them to know that I'm not necessarily a 4 minute open set. I can perform a longer show. And the other thing is to know that it's a little more diverse than you think. I mean, a lot of what we've exported is, I mean, and not to take anything away from it, but it's sort of that quirky, sort of slightly off kilter. Whereas, we have a lot of what you would consider, I don't know, straight stand up. We have political stand up. We have satire. We have everything. Yeah, I'm glad you actually haven't asked me the question, what is New Zealand comedy? What is the New Zealand sense of humor? Because I'm of a firm believer that there isn't one.
okay,
But if you simply looked at what has been successful and what we've exported, you would be totally forgiven for believing that there was. Yeah, so it's the diversity. Yeah.
sure. John, what do you think? Any thoughts or questions you wanted to ask while we had Jeremy at our disposal?
No, I think I got all the questions I want to ask. This is interesting, though. I've been trying to, like I said, in America, we kind of landlock ourselves. So it's interesting to kind of get a sense of what goes on outside of the United States and how
Mm,
things are similar, how things are different. So it's definitely been enlightening to kind of hear, like I said, how things run there and how we're so similar and different, and get a few names to kind of check out. Because, like I said, I don't know that I love New Zealand comedy. I know that I like, Flight of the Conchords and Reese Darby.
sure.
So it'll be kind of fun to check some more of it out and get a
Yeah.
sense of it. So,
The one thing I
Well, your
should have
next,
checked far earlier, I haven't been speaking too fast, do you? That's one thing New Zealanders
uh,
need to do. Well, when we tour overseas is we have to learn to slow down. We talk really quickly. So I hope I've been decipherable to all
oh
of
yes, very clear.
well, good. I actually wanted John to answer that question because I suppose I don't speak Kiwi, but I understand
I
it.
understand.
So
Yeah.
my ear is in tune. My wife is Japanese and she speaks English perfectly fine, but it is a second language for her. And when we lived in New Zealand, she wouldn't answer the telephone
Right.
because she just would answer the telephone and not understand what was being said to her. And so
Yeah.
she just put an embargo on telephone answering. And
Yeah.
I would
I heard,
occasionally have students from rural parts of New Zealand that I did not know what they were saying for sure.
there are people, there are parts of New Zealand that I don't understand what they're saying. So you're okay. Yeah. You're not alone.
There's parts of the United States where there are people. I think that's pretty much any culture. There's people with
Yeah,
really
that's
thick
true.
Yes.
That's
accents.
true,
And
right? Yeah.
Hey, do you have any plans, Jeremy, to be in North America in 2025?
Not as yet, but things tend to happen quickly.
Hmm.
When they do. So I'd love to get back over that way. I mean, obviously, we'll give it a while and just make sure you don't slam your borders shut and deny all of us visas.
Yes.
Because we don't
Or
know
then
what's
you'll
we
be
don't
trapped in as an overstayer. But
we find it
yes,
we are watching what's going on in your country from a bemused arm's length distance.
lucky you.
well, I mean, there's a
Yeah,
huge
I know.
rabbit hole there, but so we don't have to do the whole
Yeah.
9 yards. But let's do 1 yard of the 9 yards and just
Mm,
something. I in a way was privileged, but with a certain wanderlust as a young person to
mm,
travel and to live in other countries. And, that is one of the best ways to learn about your own country is to
yeah.
go far overseas and just see, hear, read different things.
Yeah.
Um, is there is there either a Jeremy Elwood take or a New Zealand take on what's happening in the U.S. right now?
Well, there's both, and they're quite different. Well, they are. I have. I don't know if you've noticed. I'm wearing a LA Angels baseball cap. I'm a I have a lot of affinity for American culture. I love my
Mhm.
visits over there. I'm a huge baseball fan. I have worked and traveled reasonably extensively in the US, and I'm very aware that you're not so much a country as a continent. I mean,
Hmm.
there are enormous differences. Two of my favorite cities in the world are Los Angeles and New Orleans, and they're different cultures. They don't even speak the same
Hmm.
language, right?
Yep.
Um, the perception, unfortunately, in I think, I mean, certainly in New Zealand and in lots of other parts of the world, is not quite that nuanced. People are divided. People are divided on what's happening in the US. I
Mhm.
mean, we have people here who think Trump's the best thing that's going to happen to the world, and we've got an awful lot of people who think you guys have just lost your minds. So
Mhm.
yeah, unfortunately, you do tend to get lumped in. People
Yep.
talk about the American way, and it's not often a compliment. It's not
Right.
how I feel, so I struggle with it myself.
Mm.
I find some of what's going on in your country fascinating, and I find some of it
Mhm.
heartbreaking. So, yeah.
Yeah, I saw a nice sociologist write an article with a nice colored map with all kinds of color usage and contours, explaining that the United States is 14 different countries,
Yeah,
and
it's
it broken it up in region, by language, by histories.
yeah. Yeah, and I
Well,
mean, and that's not even going all the way back. You know,
Right.
that's just as it is now. It's I do think, and you do find. I mean, there are. I have a lot of friends who obviously I'm a traveler myself. I have wanderlust, and a lot of my friends are like that, and they know. You know, people who've been there know. But people who are just watching everything unfold from the outside, and you're not alone. I mean, it's the same with other countries as well. You stand back and look what's happening in other parts of the world. Yeah, it's you've got to go there to you've got to travel not only to learn about your own culture, but to realize that you know that other cultures exist. It's very easy
That other
to live
cultures
it.
exist.
Yeah,
That's
you
not
really
an
do.
insignificant lesson.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, New Zealand and America actually have something that they share in terms of being,
Mm.
in a way, isolated. You know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I think one of the real advantages of our both geographic and population sort of isolation is the fact that we traditionally travel. New Zealanders do travel
Hmm.
because you can't, you know, if you are someone who's a curious person, you can see a lot, pretty much all of our country in a short part of your lifetime, you know. Where as opposed to, I sort of understand it. Again, it's a bit of a running joke around the world that the number of Americans who don't have passports. But you know, there's a hell of a lot of your country to see, and
Yes.
culturally, it's very different. I kind of get it, but yeah, I'm a
Hmm.
big believer in getting out and experiencing as much of the world as you can.
Yeah, an old boss of mine in Japan, who was a Japanese gentleman and a businessman, and a
Mm.
smart cookie, he would often he had like a similar take that people. It's sort of easy to make fun of Americans for not knowing world geography, but
Yeah,
they spent in their elementary school trying to learn 50 states.
yeah,
I mean, that's
absolutely.
already like a
Yeah,
world's worth of countries.
yeah.
So there is
Oh, I mean,
something like that going on.
yeah, and the ignorance goes. I mean, the ignorance is
It's
maybe a little harsh, but
harsh, but
the lack of understanding goes both ways. I mean,
mm,
there's a lot of New Zealanders who couldn't necessarily tell you, where Ohio is. Couldn't find it on a
mhm.
map. You know, couldn't tell you which baseball team played in Cincinnati. You know, whatever. So yeah, there's a that understanding is hard, and I'm like that with a lot of parts of the world. You know, I couldn't tell
Sure.
you much about Chinese geography. But yeah, it does go both ways. Yeah,
Yes.
and also obviously, I mean, you are in a position where if a pin drops in America, it makes the headlines. You know, so
Right.
people see that, people know, they know what they see, know what they read and they see, and you culturally you're such a behemoth of a force that
Mhm.
you can't help but sort of have an opinion on it.
John, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think I'm good. That was a really interesting conversation, I think.
Hmm. Absolutely. John, you got any interesting gigs or shows coming up?
No, I'm pretty old and boring at this point. I'll meet at Woodstock Barbecue if you want to eat some of my food, I guess.
That sounds good, actually. Yeah.
But
So, Jeremy, how about you? Anything you want to plug or anything coming up?
Well, I'm on my summer. It's that's actually sunshine coming through the windows, and so it's a quiet time of year for me at the moment. But I will have things coming up. I'll be touring around a little bit in New Zealand in March, and
Mm.
who knows, I might end up one side of the border or the other, up your way at some point in the new year. We'll see.
Well, let me know. It might be worth a road trip.
Yeah, absolutely, I will. Yeah.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks for hanging out with us this afternoon. Your host, Jerry Jaffe, the head heathen here at the Comical Heathen. And I just like to end by saying it may be your dogma, but it's my karma. And I'm all about spreading the love. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, John.
sure.
Thanks, guys.
Here we go. Don't help me.
Mhm.